The reason why I'm here today is because I'm one of the Linux platform developers, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about Linux publishing and Unity 4. This presentation is actually short. It's written for a 30-minute time slot, but due to scheduling, basically we'll just be the first out to go to lunch. And the format of the talk is quite straightforward. Actually, exporting to Linux itself is fairly simple. So I'm going to first cover an introduction to Linux for anybody who may not know, and then I want to talk some about the history of gaming on Linux and where gaming is on Linux today. And then at the end, we'll cover the technical aspects of exporting from Unity to Linux. Now, whenever I talk, I like to know some things about the audience that I'm talking with. So I'm going to ask some of you different questions, or I'm going to ask you all questions, and I'd like for you to raise your hand. First of all, how many of you personally use Linux? Okay. How many of you are already or are planning to publish your game for the Windows or Mac desktop? Okay. So how many of you are here because you care about gaming on Linux because you're a Linux user, or because you are interested in trying to tap into this market of Linux gamers? Like those who are mostly here because they care about gaming on Linux because they're Linux users. Okay. And how many of you are here because you are interested to try to tap into this market of potential gamers? Okay. All right. So briefly, I'll go over what Linux is. Most of you are Linux users, so I won't really spend much time here. Linux is obviously it's a Unix-like operating system, and it's the third most popular operating system in the world. The first, obviously, being Windows, and the second being Mac OS X. The defining characteristics of Linux is what's known as the Linux kernel, and everything on top of that can come from anywhere, but most of the user space tools and most of the applications come from what is called the GNU project. And the most unique characteristic of Linux, and one of the main reasons why I'm personally am so passionate about Linux, is the fact that it's open source. It's one of the most prominent examples of free and open source software collaboration that we have today. I've been using Linux personally for over 10 years, and I've contributed to open source software for a long time. So for me, working on this project has been very important to me because it gave me the chance to combine two things that I'm extremely passionate about. And I've always believed that the presence of games on a platform is one of the determining characteristics of whether or not it's going to actually be able to succeed. So Linux being open source, obviously that means that the underlying source code can be used or modified or distributed either commercially or non-commercially by anybody under an applicable license. And the open source nature of Linux has led to the creation and distribution of a huge number of distributions. Some of the most popular, which you can see on the slide here, we have Ubuntu, which is what we at Unity specifically work on targeting, but obviously Debian, Fedora, SUSE, several others. Now, what we refer to as a Linux distribution, obviously, is a packaged installer, a live boot disk, consisting of the Linux kernel and a set of libraries and utilities, usually from the GNU project. And graphics support for desktops distributions is provided by the X Window system. Some distributions obviously are commercially backed. Ubuntu and Red Hat and OpenSUSE are examples of commercially backed distributions. Other distributions are entirely community driven. Both commercially backed and community driven distributions have been very successful. Linux has been ported to more platforms than any other operating system in the world. Distributions exist not only for the desktop, but for servers, for mobile phones, for embedded systems, many other platforms. It's also very common in the industrial industry, for example, which is where I worked doing embedded Linux stuff before I moved into this industry to work for Unity. But the environment, obviously, that's most interesting to us today is the environment that's interesting for gaming, which is the desktop and the server platforms. So that's what I'll focus on. One other interesting aside is that a bit of exciting news, obviously, for Linux is that China has recently announced Ubuntu as a state endorsed operating system. Earlier this year, I traveled to Shanghai and gave a talk to Unity developers there, and a lot of them are very excited about our support for Unity. So I'm very excited to see what happens in that market. But Canonical is, as I mentioned, is Ubuntu's commercial backer, and they're working specifically with the Chinese Ministry of Industry and Information Technology to bring a suitable Ubuntu version specifically to China. Then a few technical facts, which I think probably most of you know because this audience is primarily full of Linux users. But obviously the Linux kernel is written in the programming language C. And it's much more popular in server space, but the desktop usage is growing steadily. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. For rendering, Linux uses OpenGL just like Mac OS X. At least it does now. And server-based installs often have no GUI whatsoever. This is particularly relevant for gaming and relates to the headless Linux player that Lucas mentioned in the keynote. And then Linux is also run on 90% of the world's supercomputers. And an interesting bit of information is that one of these is owned by a company called Weta Digital, who used their Linux cluster to create the film Avatar. And that's just like one example of how Linux is becoming more and more prominent in this industry of creating digital entertainment media. And I think that includes everything as far as the introduction goes. So let's talk a bit about gaming on Linux specifically. Historically, everybody in here I'm sure knows Linux hasn't been seen as a serious gaming platform. It shared a lot of history with the early Unix gaming scene, and commercial support, I believe, started in the early 90s with the release of Doom. How many of you played Doom? How many of you got to the end? Yeah, that's pretty Now, although we saw a steady stream of open source games and a few proprietary titles over the years, it's taken a really long time for Linux to start being seen as a platform worth targeting. Now, there are a couple of reasons for why this transition has happened so slowly. In particular, there's a few notable stumbling blocks that I'm going to discuss briefly that I think are interesting. The first one is a historical lack of good graphics drivers. Several years ago, all graphics drivers had to be developed by reverse engineering the proprietary drivers for Windows. Obviously, this wasn't so great, not only because the drivers were unstable and they had a lot of bugs, but also because it wasn't possible for application developers to actually make full use out of the capabilities of the graphics card. Now, luckily for us, this has changed with drivers now being supplied directly by AMD and NVIDIA and Intel. And the open source initiatives for creating graphics drivers have also improved significantly over the years. Another reason is a historical concern about supporting a large number of distributions. In the time that I worked at Unity leading up to our decision on whether or not to release support for Linux, every time the conversation would come up, somebody in our support team would send this graphic in a state of panic, wondering how it could actually be possible to support so many distributions. This is a graph of the split of Linux distributions through 2011, so it's a bit out of date, but close enough to show the point. Obviously, most distributions are clumped into three different categories. I'm sure most of you know, like the top group are Debian-based distributions, and the bottom group are Red Hat-based distributions, and the middle are source-based distributions. Obviously, the difference between these is primarily, from what the end user sees, is the package management system and how tools and applications are actually bundled and and packaged and provided to the user. But the good thing here is that these various distributions are all fundamentally the same. They will run on the same kernel. They all have a C++ runtime, and they're all using X11 for input and window management. At least they are now. We'll see what actually happens with Ubuntu and Mir and what we need to do to support that in the future. But in any case, like, it looks like a lot of distributions, but the problem is solvable because Linux actually is Linux underneath what we see as far as differences in the package management system and what desktop manager people are using, things like that. Okay, so another likely reason that Linux hasn't been targeted as a serious gaming platform is just a concern that Linux users won't actually pay for commercial games. And this has always been a concern, and as a Linux user, it's always bothered me because it's also a self-perpetuating cycle. Because historically, very few commercial vendors would actually bring games to Linux, and so we haven't had a lot of data to actually indicate whether or not people would buy games. And so because there's not a lot of data, commercial vendors won't bring games to Linux, and this problem just continues. I think we're finally starting to see a change now. More recently, initiatives like the Humble Indie Bundle, for example, have indicated demand for games on Linux is growing, and it's not as insignificant as we once thought. And then, of course, more recent things like Steam kind of indicate the same thing. And let's see. Then, yeah. So now we've seen a brief history about gaming on Linux. I want to talk a bit about the current state of gaming on Linux. Now, in 2012, two significant things happened for gaming on Linux. One was that Valve announced Steam support for Linux. And then two was that Unity announced Linux runtime support. Now, Linux runtime support in Unity launched with Humble Indie Bundle 6 with a game called Richard. And since then, games like Splice and Snuggle Truck and others have followed in later Humble Indie Bundles. And Unity games for Linux have also shown up on other distribution platforms as well. Steam support for Linux was announced in July of 2012, and Valve shipped a beta client in December. And I believe official support for Steam on Linux was released in just February of this year. And now in 2013, Linux continues to grow. This year, a minimum of 50 million computers will ship with Ubuntu Linux pre-installed. We're seeing higher and higher adoption of Linux on the desktop. It's debatable what the reason why is. Some people argue that people are looking for an alternative to Windows 8, for example, or an alternative to platforms like Windows and OS X that are becoming more and more closed. But I don't know the reason why, but I won't argue with it. Linux market share on the desktop is really hard to estimate. It's small. It is growing. We know from things like web browser analytics from 2008 to 2009, Linux market share rose from like 1.3 to 2.2%, I think. But the browser-based estimation is primarily a North American web-based measurement. And Linux actually has much higher penetration in non-North American markets. It's actually estimated to be between 8 and 12% in some Asian countries. So recently, Valve has announced or released Steam for Linux, and we released runtime support for Linux, and now we have more and more game shipping, and then Linux is growing. So I think it's a very, very exciting time to be a Linux user, and particularly a Linux gamer. But if you're making games and you want to publish them to Linux, let's go over just a few of the top distribution methods so that you know what your options are. Now, obviously the most successful distribution method on Linux is Steam. Steam for Linux launched publicly in, like I said, I think it was February of this year, and statistics for March showed, I think about 2% of all Steam users are on some variant of Linux, while 3% were on some version of OS X. The rest were on some version of Windows. So it took, I believe, OS X a lot longer to even get to their 3%. So the rate of adoption of Steam on Linux has been quite rapid. One thing to note is that many Unity games are getting onto Steam via Steam Greenlight. I'm sure all of you know, but for those that don't, Steam Greenlight is basically a system where Valve uses community voting as a mechanism to determine whether or not a game should actually be added to Steam. And I think a lot of that is because a lot of Unity games are coming from like these smaller studios that aren't able to negotiate ahead of time deals with Valve to get their games on Steam. But I love Steam. I'm on there all the time. My Steam ID is Natasha, N-A-T-O-S-H-A. You can add me if you want to play Guns of Icarus. That's what I've been playing all the time lately. I know the other Linux platform developer, Levi, like, he cannot stop buying games on Steam. Like, it's as a Linux user, it's the first time ever to just have this large selection of native Linux games to be able to play, and for the first time ever to not have to kind of worry about whether or not a game would actually run under emulation in order to be able to play it. But yeah, so I'm really happy about Steam being on Linux, and by far for our users, it's the most successful distribution platform. Another option that's probably the second most successful, I would say, is the Ubuntu Software Center. It's an app store for Ubuntu, and the nice thing about it is that Canonical will offer a free packaging service for you, so that all you have to do is supply them with the raw binary output from Unity into a deb package, or from Unity, and then they will package it into a deb package, which is the package format used by Ubuntu. The free packaging service and submission to the Ubuntu Software Center can be accessed by going to developer.ubuntu.com and setting up a free account. These guys are super, super helpful to all of our users. And if you have any trouble or any questions, just let them know. Like, we work with them very, very closely as well. So yeah, that's definitely an option. I think it's probably the second most successful distribution method for our users. The third is another digital distribution platform called Desura. It has clients for Windows, OS X, and Linux. It's kind of designed, I think, more for smaller indie developers who aren't large enough to be able to negotiate deals with to get their games on Steam. There's not really much to say. It's very straightforward. You can go to their website and sign up. There are a fair number of Unity games on there. I don't think that, from talking to our users, they don't sell as well on Desura as they do on Steam or on the Ubuntu Software Center, but it's very, very easy to get your game on there. So, if it were me, I wouldn't see any reason not to do it. And then fourth, it's kind of a different one, is the Humble Indie Bundle. Obviously, these are very popular. Many of the bundles have done over $1 million US, and I think together they've done over like 34 million US dollars or something like that. Often the games are scouted, but if you'd like to submit a game, and I know that when we worked with the guys over at the Humble Indie Bundle, they were really, really excited that Unity was releasing Linux runtime support, because there are a lot of games that they couldn't get into their bundles. So, like I said, most of the games are scouted, but you can always go to, I think it's humblebundle.com/contact and fill out their submission form. And then, so that kind of covers the distribution methods. And then finally, well, not quite finally, but the next thing I want to talk about is exporting specifically for Linux and Unity 4. In Unity 4, you can export your game to the Linux desktop just in the same way you can with Windows or with OS X. Now, this export feature is available both in Unity Free and in Unity Pro at no extra charge. Actually, building a player is very, very simple. In Unity 4, the build settings window now shows Linux, obviously, alongside OS X and Windows standalone targets. If you select Linux, you're going to have 3 different options for architectures. x86 for 32-bit machines, x86 64 for 64-bit machines, and then what we possibly mistakenly called a universal option. I've been contacted by some users thinking that this meant we've like implemented fat binaries for Linux. We haven't actually. All that is it's just a convenient way to export your game data and both the 32 and 64-bit players into one folder so that the user will be sure to have whichever binary they need in order to run the game. If you're submitting to the Ubuntu Software Center, I know that the universal export option is the one that they prefer because they'll build both 32 and 64-bit installation packages out of your game. And the system requirements for the desktop player are really, really simple. We worked hard to remove as many external dependencies as possible so that even on highly configured machines, the player would be able to run out of the box. You obviously need a C++ runtime, which you're going to have if you have pretty much any user space tools or applications installed. You need a 32 or 64-bit architecture. So like these are desktop architectures, so no like ARM or tablets or anything like that. And then you need graphics drivers that provide hardware acceleration. And then in Unity 4.2, as was mentioned, we've added this option for headless mode. It's just a build option whenever you build the player. And what this does is it builds a player that it's designed to run on headless servers that are maybe in the cloud or in some data center that not only do they not have X running, but they don't even have X installed. So this player automatically launches in batch mode with no graphics and won't try to do any rendering or whatsoever. It's designed for like if you have if you want to have like a central server for a network-based game, for example. Yes? Right. So the question is related to, like, so Mac builds can be run in headless mode. That is true. And the regular Linux player can also be run in headless mode as well. But the difference is that the headless mode player doesn't require, like, X11 to be installed on the machine, which is going to be the case for, like, many, like, stock Linux server installs. Whereas the desktop player, even if you launch it in batch mode with no graphics, like, it still needs X11 to be installed because it still renders, it just renders to a null graphics device. Like, this doesn't actually render at all. So it's mostly a matter of convenience. Like, if you control the server, you can obviously install X11 in most cases. So this is really just a matter of convenience for your users. Obviously, the binary is a bit smaller as well if, for some reason, you're very concerned about a tiny amount of space. But yeah, so I know that was some of a lot of the initial feedback that we got back. So we've added that in Linux 4. Or in Unity 4.2, and the requirements for the headless mode player are simple. Like, all you need is a C++ runtime, nothing more, nothing less. So in terms of distribution support, which is another common question, officially at Unity we offer support for Ubuntu 10.10 or later. There's nothing special about 10.10 except that that's the version of Ubuntu that was installed in our automated build farm whenever we started doing this. I think with 4.2 it might actually go back to 10.04 because we changed the version of Linux installed. But in any case, the player runs without problems on a wide range of Linux desktops. I've seen users, like Arch Linux was actually a distribution that I didn't really expect to be represented in any statistics, but there's a small number, but visible number of users there. We have a lot of users obviously using Gentoo and Debian, very old versions of like some versions of Linux I wouldn't have expected to be installed on a desktop at all, like CentOS, and I've gotten feedback from users that it's running on all sorts of Linuxes, ones that we would consider mainstream or ones that we consider weird or whatever. And so even though our official support is for Ubuntu, I don't think that our users should be concerned about filing bugs found on other distributions of Linux, because possibly, in many cases, they can be reproduced even on Ubuntu with a slightly different configuration. And we're happy to, although we obviously give preference to investigating problems specifically on Ubuntu, we're happy to look into whatever we can. So if you find bugs specific to other distributions, please report them anyway. And then, right, let's go over a couple of tips for developing Unity games for Linux. First of all is unredirect full screen windows. On some machines, this is a setting for compiz. The setting unredirect full screen windows is not turned on. This, I believe, is fixed in Ubuntu 12.10. After we spent some time talking to the guys that are making Ubuntu, but on earlier versions of Ubuntu and on other distributions, this setting will probably not be turned on by default. What this setting does is it basically allows drawing on full screen windows to not be redirected to off-screen pix maps. So if a game is running in full screen, not having this setting on can affect the performance significantly, like even up to 50% of the possible frame rate. So if there's any kind of a performance problem, this is always the first thing that should be checked. And then because there's no editor available for Linux, you have to edit and build your Linux games on Windows or OS X. It's obviously inconvenient to have to do this, and for some reason it took me a while for this to occur to me, but what I do now that makes it a lot easier is I just have a post-process build step that will automatically copy the game to my Linux machine. You can do that easily with an editor script like I've done here. This one copies to a share that's mounted locally on my Mac, but you could also use SFTP or SCP or whatever you want. So yeah, it took me a while to think about how easy it would be to automate that, and then once I did it, it stopped being quite such a pain. So I'll just throw that out there. And then finally, we have a few things that are either done or not yet released or in development. One of these is headless mode, obviously, which I've talked to you and will be in Unity 4.2. Another thing is that in Unity 4.2, webcam support for Linux also exists, the same as it does for the other desktop machines, or desktop platforms. A couple of things we want to work on in the future are better Steam integration. This is not actually so specific to Linux, but it's something that I care a lot about now that Steam is out for Linux. A lot of our users have a lot of trouble getting everything to work nicely with like the Steam API and things like that. So I'd like to figure out a way to possibly work with Valve or do whatever we need to do to figure out how to integrate that better and make the process less painful. And then finally, I would really like to optimize for open source drivers. They don't have the same capabilities that the proprietary drivers do, but that doesn't mean that we can't provide as good of a user experience as possible. I mean, actually, the user experience for many games is quite good already with open source drivers, but we haven't really invested resources in optimizing for the open source drivers. So that's one thing that I would really like to do and hoping to do later on in the 4X cycle, but we'll see. That concludes everything that I've prepared to present today. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
Are there any plans to port Unity editor to Linux also?
I get asked this question all the time. I don't have a good answer. I don't know. It's something that's being researched. We haven't decided that we're going to do it, but we haven't decided that we're not going to do it either. It really comes down to whether or not there's a good reason for us commercially to do it. There's obviously a lot more tech in our editor, and support burden for the editor is a lot higher than it is for the runtime. Currently, there's also issues with, we use like some middleware, like our light mapping middleware, for example, that doesn't exist for Linux, so we would need to sort these things out. That's not to say these problems are not solvable by any means, but yeah, we haven't decided whether or not we will, but we do listen to our users, so I mean, when we talk about this internally, one of the things that comes up is we don't really have an indication how many users actually want the editor to be on Linux. So people who do, I encourage you to do whatever you can to make sure that we know that you exist. So, any other questions? Yeah.
Are there any specific types of games that would be a better match for Linux users over others?
I would say, from what little bit I've seen in terms of like reactions to groups of Linux users that are game reels and stuff like that, I would say one of the least successful genres is going to be first-person shooters, because that's like, not because they're not good and not because we don't enjoy playing them, but I think that first-person shooters have existed for a long time on Linux, but now there's opportunity for, you know, different types of games in different genres. So, for example, when late last year, I was at the Ubuntu Developer Summit, and we showed part of a game reel, and it included games, for example, like Dead Trigger, which people kind of thought was funny, but then, yeah, there were lots of oohs and ahs about other games like Splice and ones like that. So, in my opinion, I would say that, thinking, I guess, away from the games we traditionally had on Linux, like first-person shooters and things like that, I know RC Mini Racers, which is a racing game, sold pretty well on the Ubuntu Software Center, and I think that's because like racing games just aren't prominent on Linux compared to other genres. So I haven't really studied the market, but from my perspective, that's at least my opinion. Anything else?
Are there any features that are not available for Linux players?
For the Linux player?
No, I mean, when you develop for Windows and Mac desktop, is it equivalent what you get for the Linux port? Or are the technical areas to avoid? And if so, what are the three top?
As far as I'm aware, the Linux, as of Unity 4.2, which includes the webcam stuff, as far as I'm aware, Linux, the actual runtime has full feature parity. The only difference is that, the only difference I know of is that on Windows and OS X, you have a screen selector that you can use to alter like the key bindings before the game starts, and that doesn't exist on Linux. The reason why it doesn't exist is because we just haven't solved the problem. We aren't really inclined to write a screen selector that's going to pull in a dependency for something like GTK or Qt or something like that. We thought, well, maybe we can write one in Unity, but I mean, Unity's not really running at that point, so we don't have Unity GUI. So there's a few options that we have. So that means that basically, if you want to be able to configure the key bindings, you need to be using your own input manager, at least until we rewrite the input manager. Yeah, so not having a screen selector is, as far as I'm aware, the only problem. And this is a problem that we can solve, but actually I haven't had anybody complain to me about it, so I don't know of it being a real issue. Okay, anything else? Yep. Just wait for the guy with the mic.
Do you have an estimated release date of Unity 4.5 for 4.2 with Linux support?
Well, that's always hard to say because it depends on what problems our beta users find. It's gone through development, it's gone through the alpha cycle, it's into the beta cycle now. It's on, I think we're going into beta 2, so I think it should be like on the order of, yeah, soon.
You know, when it's done, yes?
We don't like to, I work at Unity, so I've been interjecting. If it's in beta, it's close. If there's a number of issues, obviously we want to resolve them before we move it to release. That's why we don't, even with it being so close to being complete, we don't want to lock down and say it's going to be out on this date, because then tomorrow, Natasha can wake up to her email and there's a bunch of stuff that needs to be fixed that we would want to address before it goes out to you all.
Yeah, it's not like we try to purposefully be like very secret about our release dates. It's just that usually a week before we actually push the release live, like we don't actually even know that it is actually ready to go out. because we especially iterate a lot more quickly now with the rapid release cycles and then going through the beta list. So yeah, we're on beta 2. So yeah, like you said, it'll be out on the order of soon. Okay, anything else?
What about the performance with proprietary drivers? For example, like Steam developers, they were writing in their blog that way they were able to run games on Linux with the same hardware faster than on Windows.
That's very true. It's very, very true. Yeah, obviously the performance depends some on which driver, which card, whatever. But if you have the exact same hardware with Windows, or especially with OS X, because Apple ships very old drivers, their performance is usually much better on Linux than it is on Windows.
Is there anything I need to be aware of in terms of shader support and compatibility?
No, we've run into a few bugs with AMD's proprietary drivers with very specific shaders, but very much in the Unity way. We've resolved this problem in the engine after going back and forth with the guys at AMD. So as far as I'm aware, there's nothing special that you need to be aware of. Anything else? Do we have any stats on how many people are building for Linux? Maybe, but I don't know. I don't know what we track in the editor analytics, so I don't know if we track that, or if we do, how many people there would be. I know in terms of the player, we actually added analytics for the actual player, so we could get some information about like what sorts of machines and stuff people were actually running Unity games on. And it was one of the components in our analytics server dying after we released that. So now we actually don't track those right now while we sort out how we actually want to move the infrastructure to be able to deal with this large influx of new I guess new Unity game players. I don't know. So yeah, but I'm sorry, I don't know what that would be. Okay. So doesn't look like there are any other questions. Cool. Then I guess we're done. And yeah, if you want to speak to me privately, or if you want to have one of my business cards, or whatever, just feel free to find me after. Cool. Thank you.